Welcome back to our channel World of Royals.
Behind every carefully controlled public image, there exists a version of reality that never fully makes it into the light. A version that is edited, reshaped, and sometimes quietly buried beneath layers of storytelling. But no matter how deep something is hidden, the past has a way of resurfacing, especially when the people who know it best decide to stop staying silent. For years, one name remained almost completely absent from the global narrative that followed Meghan Markle's rise. Not erased entirely, but reduced, minimized. Trevor Engelson, once a central figure in her life, became a footnote in a story that quickly moved beyond him. A chapter closed so cleanly that it almost felt intentional. But silence does not mean the story ended. And now, according to emerging claims, that silence may be breaking in a way no one anticipated. Because this is no longer being described as reflection. It is being framed as exposure. Sources suggest that Engelson is no longer willing to remain in the background while a version of events continues to dominate the public space, one that, according to these claims, may not tell the full story. And when someone who was present during the earliest stages begins to speak, the impact is immediate. Because proximity changes everything. This is not speculation from a distance. This is someone who was there before the narrative became global. Before the interviews, before the titles, before the transformation into a figure known across continents. And that proximity gives weight to what is now being suggested. The focus, naturally, turns to what exactly could be revealed. And that is where the tension begins to build. Because the claims do not center on recent events. They reach back, far back, to a period that existed long before the public version of the story took shape. A time that was never fully explored in detail, perhaps because there was no reason to explore it. Or perhaps because it was never meant to be part of the narrative at all. But now, those early chapters are being revisited. And within them, there are suggestions that certain elements may not have been fully disclosed. Not necessarily hidden in a dramatic sense, but left unaddressed. Left outside the version of events that was eventually presented to the world. And that distinction matters. Because when a narrative is built on selected details, the absence of certain elements can be just as significant as what is included. And once that absence is questioned, everything else begins to shift. What was once accepted without hesitation becomes subject to scrutiny. What once felt complete begins to feel incomplete. And once that process starts, it does not stop easily. Because every answer leads to another question. And every question leads deeper into the story. As the narrative begins to stretch backward into those earlier, less examined years, the nature of the conversation starts to change. It is no longer centered on what the public has seen, but on what may have existed outside of that visibility. And that shift, from known to unknown, is where uncertainty begins to take hold. Because when a story reaches the level of global recognition, it is expected to be complete, thoroughly examined, fully understood, especially when that story intersects with an institution built on scrutiny, tradition, and process. Nothing is supposed to slip through unnoticed. And yet, the emerging claims suggest that something might have. Not necessarily in a way that was obvious at the time, but in a way that only becomes visible when the timeline is re-examined in reverse. When earlier moments are revisited with the knowledge of what came later. When connections that once seemed unrelated begin to align. This is where the idea of omission enters the conversation. Not as a confirmed fact, but as a possibility. A possibility that certain details, certain chapters, may not have been fully presented when the narrative was being formed. And if that possibility holds even partial truth, it raises a much larger question. How does something go unnoticed in a system designed to notice everything? That question alone introduces a level of tension that cannot be ignored. Because the process itself is built on verification, on examining history from every angle, on ensuring that nothing exists outside the frame of understanding before someone steps into a role that carries global visibility. So, if something was not included in that process, the implications extend far beyond the detail itself. They extend into trust. And trust, once questioned, becomes difficult to restore. But beyond the institutional implications, there is a more immediate layer, the personal one. Because over time, the public narrative has not just been about events. It has been about identity, about values, about a consistent portrayal of character that has been reinforced again and again through appearances, interviews, and carefully chosen moments. And when new claims begin to challenge that portrayal, the reaction is immediate. Not because the claims are proven, but because of what they suggest. A gap between perception and reality. And that gap, once introduced, begins to widen. Because people do not just respond to facts, they respond to patterns, to consistency, to the sense that what they are seeing aligns with what they believe to be true. And when that alignment is disrupted even slightly, it changes how everything else is viewed. Past statements are reconsidered. Past moments are reinterpreted. And the narrative, once stable, begins to shift. Not dramatically at first, not all at once, but gradually, piece by piece, until the version that once felt complete no longer feels certain. And once uncertainty takes hold, the story moves into an entirely different phase. As the focus continues to move deeper into the structure of the narrative, the conversation begins to shift once again, this time away from individual claims and towards something broader, something more complex. The way public identities are constructed in the first place. Because no narrative, no matter how authentic it appears, exists without some level of shaping. Every public figure makes choices: what to reveal, what to hold back, what to emphasize, and what to quietly leave behind. Over time, those choices begin to form a pattern. And that pattern becomes the image the world recognizes. But what happens when that pattern is examined from a different angle? That is where things begin to change. Because according to the emerging discussion, there are indications that parts of this image may not have developed as naturally as they appeared. That certain transitions, moments that seemed organic, may have been more carefully managed than previously understood. Not necessarily fabricated, not necessarily false, but structured. And that distinction matters, because structure implies intention. It suggests that the narrative did not simply unfold. It was guided, adjusted, refined over time to align with a particular direction, a particular identity. This is where digital history becomes critical, because even when information is removed, it is rarely gone completely. Fragments remain, archived pages, old platforms, previous versions of identity that still exist, waiting to be rediscovered. And when those fragments begin to surface, they create a second timeline, a parallel version of events that runs alongside the one the public knows. At first, the differences may seem minor. Small inconsistencies, slight variations in tone, in messaging, in presentation. But when viewed collectively, those differences begin to form a pattern of their own. A pattern of evolution, a pattern of repositioning, and potentially a pattern of reinvention. This does not automatically confirm anything on its own, but it introduces a possibility. The possibility that the narrative as it exists today is not just the result of circumstance, but the result of deliberate progression. A series of calculated steps that led from one identity to another, each phase building on the last. And once that possibility enters the conversation, everything becomes subject to reinterpretation. Moments that once seemed spontaneous begin to feel strategic. Decisions that once appeared emotional begin to feel calculated. And the line between authenticity and presentation becomes increasingly difficult to define. Because at that point, the question is no longer just about what happened. It becomes about how it was presented.
And why?
And once those questions are asked, they do not remain contained. They expand. They connect. And they begin to reshape the entire narrative from the inside out. As the narrative continues to evolve in the public space, there is another dimension unfolding, one that is far less visible but potentially far more impactful. Because while audiences analyze, question, and speculate from the outside, there are individuals at the center of this situation who are experiencing it in real time. And according to emerging reports, that internal environment may be shifting, not in a way that is immediately visible, not through public statements or sudden changes, but through something quieter, more subtle, a change in tone, a change in dynamic. Because when questions begin to surface externally, they do not stay external for long. They move inward. Conversations that were once hypothetical begin to take on urgency. Questions that were once dismissed become harder to ignore. And in that shift, the nature of those conversations changes. This is where the situation becomes deeply personal. Because beyond the structure of public identity, beyond the carefully maintained narrative, there are relationships, private understandings, shared histories that exist outside of public view. And when those are placed under pressure, the response is not immediate resolution. It is uncertainty. Because trust does not operate in the same way as public perception. It is not influenced by headlines or commentary. It is built on clarity, on a shared understanding of what is true. And when that clarity is disrupted, even slightly, it creates tension. Not necessarily visible tension, but present, growing. Because the questions being raised are not just about events. They are about consistency, about alignment between what is known privately and what has been presented publicly. And when those two begin to diverge, even in perception, it introduces doubt. That doubt does not resolve itself quickly. It lingers. It expands. And it begins to influence every interaction that follows. This creates a unique kind of pressure. Not the pressure of public scrutiny, that is already expected, but the pressure of internal uncertainty, of not having all the answers, of trying to understand a situation that is still unfolding while being directly affected by it. And that is where the stakes become significantly higher. Because at that point, it is no longer just about how the story is perceived. It is about how it is experienced, from the inside. And once a situation reaches that level, the outcome is no longer shaped solely by narrative. It is shaped by decisions, by responses, by how those involved choose to navigate a reality that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. At this point, the situation has moved beyond isolated claims or individual interpretation. It has entered a space where multiple forces are now intersecting at once: public perception, personal reality, and institutional awareness. And when all three begin to align around the same questions, the outcome is rarely simple. Because institutions do not respond the way individuals do. They do not react quickly. They do not move impulsively. Instead, they observe. They assess. They wait until every variable has been considered before taking action. And that process, while slower, carries far greater weight. What we are seeing now is that period of observation. A moment where information is being examined from every angle. Where implications are being measured not just for the present, but for the future. Because when a narrative intersects with an institution built on continuity, every decision must be made with long-term consequence in mind. This is why the silence feels so significant. It is not avoidance. It is calculation. A pause before movement. A space where outcomes are being projected, where every possible scenario is being evaluated before a single step is taken. But silence does not last forever. Because as more details begin to surface, as more connections are examined, the room for ambiguity starts to disappear. And once that happens, clarity follows. Whether that clarity confirms what is being suggested or challenges it entirely remains uncertain. But what is certain is that it will change the direction of the story. Because once a narrative reaches this stage, once it begins to shift under the weight of new questions, it cannot return to its original form. It evolves. It expands. It becomes something different. And for those at the center of it, that evolution comes with consequences. Not just in how they are seen, but in what decisions they are forced to make moving forward. Because the coming days will not be defined by speculation alone. They will be defined by response. By whether silence continues or is replaced by clarity. By whether the narrative stabilizes or continues to unravel. And for those watching from the outside, the question remains open. What happens when a carefully constructed story meets a version of the past that refuses to stay hidden? Let me know what you think. Do you believe this situation will lead to a direct response, or will it remain unresolved beneath the surface? Because as this continues to unfold, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This is no longer just a story. It is a turning point,